Mixing with my mixing tip, adding vintage warmth without losing presence. One of the issues that we always have in working with tracks is that we want to get some of that kind of old vintage warmth, but we don't really want to lose any of the presence, and we don't want it to sound muddy. And when you actually use vintage processors in the right way, what you end up doing is you end up creating a depth and a body to the low end, a solidity to the low end that actually makes it image much better. Now, what's interesting, if you actually listen to a lot of vintage records, is that that have that warmth and that body, they also have a lot of crispness on the top end. So they weren't shy to really boost higher frequencies to sort of balance that low end. And it's a real key component when working with this stuff. See, the thing is, there's a relationship. There's a relationship between the low frequencies and the low mid frequencies, where if there's too much low mid frequency, it will have a tendency to pull that low sub frequency energy up into the speakers. And what you'll find is that your sounds, where your bass and your kick drum, instead of dropping low in the speakers, will have a tendency to rise and pull up into the speakers. There are two aspects to that. One is that the solidity of the imaging is not quite right. It's very difficult on the low end to get it to really solidify, and this is where the vintage processing comes in really handy. I'm going to get into this in a second, because the other part of it which bounces that off is what's going on in the top frequencies. So when you balance the top frequencies with the sub frequencies, what happens is you get this effect where certain things lower in the speakers, like the sub frequencies lower in the speakers, and the higher energy stuff raises up in the speaker. So this would be air, this would be reverb, this would be cymbals, the top end of a vocal, all of that sort of stuff that gives some air and some presence around things. So what I want to do is, I have a track here that I'm working on in the mixing with my classes, and what we've done is we've just done a layer of processing. We've primarily used the SSL channel compressors, which, G series, not really vintage. That, this is like late 80s into early 90s type of sound. But we use this as a functional way to kind of pump and breathe the track. And then what I did was to add a layer of some vintage processing, primarily working with a bit with the V-comp, which I really love, because it adds like a nice solidity, and it really characterizes that essence of low-end kind of ballsiness that kind of comes in. And so that's where I want to focus here. There, and I'm also working with VEQ stuff, which is old vintage Neve stuff from the 70s. So what you get with these components is, on that warmth side, is a way of solidifying low mid-range. The Neve components are really spectacular with their transformers. Rupert Neve's transformers were probably one of the most amazing ever made in terms of really solidifying some things. So I just want to play you a little bit of what we have going on here. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to go straight to this, and in talking about the top end here, I'm going to bring in some top end here on hi-hats. Doesn't take a lot, but this is just to kind of balance out the low end. So wait till we get to a hi-hats. We could go right back to the beginning. Just notice the difference when I take these VEQs out. Notice we really don't focus so much on the high frequencies, but what happens to the low end. Notice how it's a little bit muddier there. And so this is a very common way of just sort of balancing out what goes on in those sub frequencies. So you need some kind of contrast there in order to help that vintage warmth sync. But when using vintage components, when you start to bring in those frequencies, as opposed to doing it with a sort of stock EQ plugin, or just even if it's a real high end EQ plugin, high quality in terms of the phase efficiency of it and all of those sorts of things, where it's really clean, it won't have a tendency to have as warm a character as what you get when working with the vintage components. So I want to show you here what I've done here just very quickly with the V comps to kind of help to bring in some of this character of the warmth. So this is bypassing all of the V comps. Now there's a little bit of boost in gain overall, but really it's listen for the depth and imaging of the low end. And what we're really looking at here with some of these things is sometimes some pretty heavy compression where there is a significant amount of it, and it's finding that right place to get it to pump and breathe, to kind of move. I have another video that talks specifically about the V comp and why you select different compression zones, ratios, and release times to kind of follow that. And that's something that that along with another video that follows up right around the same time, which is on getting the feel for compression, where you're looking to get the feel of the movement of it. Those types of videos, that's what I'm going for here on individual tracks. So some of these things I will play around with some of the different characteristics, like just here with the kick drum, for example. Noticing the difference in the characteristic between 400 and the auto. Because like with the auto, it just images so much more solidly. That's a little better. And this is where working with a multi-stage release has an initial release characteristic, but then a sustain, which helps to broaden the sustain of the kick drum. And these types of things here. Also, working with the VEQ here, what I'm doing is working with some VEQ 4s when I want to focus real tight areas to kind of focus sounds into a particular place. And this allows me to really bring in more density in smaller pockets of frequency band. So just listen to this, and I'll bypass all of the VEQs here. And where the VEQ is really, especially the VEQ 4, is really amazing for this, with this high Q switch, you can get a very like phase shifty kind of focus, a filtered kind of focus within a frequency band. So the high Q switch here on this EQ creates a narrower Q that allows you to focus within a particular set of frequencies, and there's loads to choose from. So this is the 1081, I believe it's 1081, yeah, 1081 5-band or 4-band EQ. By Rupert Neve. It's one of the later ones. Actually, I'm not sure if this one was a Rupert Neve one. I know he left the company in the mid-70s, and I think this came out later in the 70s, but he may have designed it, and it ended up in some of the later consoles. This is a really powerful one for that, whereas the VEQ3 sort of emulates a little bit more of the 1073, 1061 EQ, which had more... it was a little bit warmer sounding overall, or more broader, softer, not as focused overall. You didn't have as much control in terms of the filtering. But this combination of the two really helps to create some power. And then, of course, throwing a little optical limiter on the bass to help bring out some of the imaging. This is the Universal Audio. here are the base images. Optical components are really amazing at sustaining instruments like this in terms of bringing out the character or the imaging of them. Like optical components or optical compressors in particular have a great way of adding a character. It's hard to describe. It's like what I like to say is like shining a light on a dark object, where now all of a sudden you can see the detail of it. That's the best way I could describe it. And because it's actually a light component, right? It's a photoresistant component that's used, and you have a something that is reading those changes of pulses in light, and that's what actually creates the photoelectric cell. That was what I was looking for. And what you're doing there is you're getting the movement, or the limiting of the compressor is basically worked by the way that light reacts and how the sensor picks up those changes in light. And so you get this, for whatever reason, this real smooth but also very enlightening kind of characteristic about it, where it really brings the imaging in. And coupled with the transformers and tubes, the tubes have a nice sizzle on the top end, which helps to do this exact thing that I was talking about, where raising the high frequency energy helps to balance out the low frequency energy. And it does that while also with the tubes and transformers creating a solidity of imaging on the low end. It's really powerful. This is the original one, the LA2. And then here's just to show you what the vintage layers are doing overall. And there, with that, you get like this basic idea of kind of getting that vintage warmth while still preserving some of the ballsiness and grittiness. But it's a combination of things, and you have to kind of work it and play with it a bit, and kind of get the whole balancing of the way that works. The balance of the sub and the high frequencies, and then also using the right components to solidify the low mids and low frequencies so that it images correctly. And that's really the whole key. That's the whole vibe to that sound. And then, of course, there's plenty of things I can tweak in here. We're just like only partway through this mix in terms of working with it, but you could already hear like there's a significant difference in the character than just the base SSL processing, which is mostly simply just some basic functional compression to kind of get things moving, and a little bit of EQ to kind of carve away some of the inconsistencies, and bring out a little bit more of the character of the individual parts. The analog stuff does it on a whole other level, and that's where bringing in those vintage emulations really helps. All right, as a Mixing with Mike mixing tip, adding vintage warmth without losing presence.